Hi, welcome to NNP Symposium. This is our Friday, 12 p.m. Eastern Time session. And this will feature Jesse Kraft speaking on the early history of the Medallic Art Company. This presentation will shine some light onto the clouded history of the Medallic Art Company, known as MACO, between 1902 and 1920. These early years follow the firm as it grew from a side project for an employee at a ladies' handbag company, tell how bitter legal struggles almost left the young company bankrupt, and show that the foresight of a young entrepreneur transformed the firm into one of the most important producers of 20th century medallic art in the United States. So Jesse, if you want to go ahead and unmute and start your video. Jesse Kraft is assistant curator of U.S. coins at American Numismatic Society, and they've acquired the MACO archives over the last year or two and have been busy processing this collection. So with that, Jesse, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Len. Thank you for that introduction. As Len had pointed out, this is going to be about the early history of the Medallic Art Company, otherwise known as MACO. To some degree, this is kind of an easy story to tell because it's the more written about kind of time period about MACO. But on the other side of the story, it's not so easy to tell because it's been so written about that many people have kind of added some lore into the story that isn't 100% verifiable. And lastly, I would also like to dedicate this presentation to Dick Johnson, who passed away in December of 2020, and who did so much work for MACO. I think he had close to a 5-decade relationship with MACO from the 60s up until just before his death. So to give you a brief kind of background with the ANS history of the MACO archives. The ANS purchased the archives from a bankruptcy auction in 2018. We were able to save the dies, die shells, at least one representation of every single metal that they ever struck, as well as a lot of paper and digital archives as well. Here you can see a picture of the dies. On the lower left is their last headquarters. The top right, you can see shelves just filled with galvanos. And in the bottom right picture is metal is actually being delivered to our headquarters here in New York City. This is Rob Vigdeveen, who has been an incredible resource. He worked for MACO towards the end of their time as a company and has helped us out greatly in the past 3 years as well. And here behind him, you can see 2 rows of shelves filled with galvanos to the left, and then 2 rows filled with the dies to the right. So just to give you kind of an idea of the magnitude of this collection, this is only about half of it when you include the paper material as well as the metals themselves. All right. So let's back up about 100 years or so. The story really begins with Henry Weil, who is the founder of MACO. He was born in December 18th, 1867 in Hoboken, New Jersey, but his family moved back to France when he was only 6 weeks old, sorry. And then he returned to the United States in 1879. In 1884, he was apprenticed to George Wagner, who was a sculptor. He was actually the husband of Weil's older sister at the time. Between 1888 and 1902, he worked, had several jobs in the sculpting realm. He worked for Borman Company as a sculptor's assistant during the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and also for a terracotta company in Chicago. In 1902, he found employment with the Ditch Brothers in New York City. And from in between 1903 and 1907, he formed the Medallic Art Company. So I'm going to talk about the Ditch Brothers a little bit, who employed Henry Weil during this time when MACO was in its nascent state. They primarily were makers of quote-unquote sterling mounted leather goods. A lot of references you'll see to the Ditch Brothers that they made ladies' handbags, and this is true. But they really made many, many things. Anything made of leather that you can stick stuff in that had metallic trim on it was essentially what they had focused on. Henry himself was hired to sculpt all the silver trim that you can see, and then also cast it for use on their products. Here's another advertisement of the Ditch Brothers, and here you can actually see on either side of the purses a list, essentially, of the different products that they made. So they definitely made ladies' handbags, but they also made many other things like card cases, watch bracelets, spectacle glass cases, cigar cases, and many, many other things. Again, essentially anything that you can make of leather, stick some silver trim on it, and sell it is what they made. And actually here at the bottom, you can see that they claimed that they themselves were the originators in novelties in leather and silver combination. While working for the Ditch Brothers and on a trip to France, Henry had observed some French-made purses and handbags and stuff similar to what his employers were making, except he realized that the metallic components of them weren't cast as they were making back in the United States, but they were actually extremely well-defined and struck objects, much like a coin is. So he was extremely intrigued by this, and he realized or found out that these metal components were being made on the Janvier pantograph, which is this object here, the Janvier pantograph. Well, what is a pantograph? First of all, pantograph is technically any mechanical device that allows for design to be traced while it simultaneously reproduces that same design on a different location. Furthermore, the size of the second object can be the same exact size as the first design that's traced, or it can be smaller, or it can be enlarged. And it also can be used for 1D, 2D, or 3D objects. Victor Janvier, pictured here to the right, he did not invent this contraption, a pantograph, but he certainly perfected it, and also allowed, he began the company, the Janvier Pantograph Company, that allowed for the mass production, sales, and also training on these machines. Before this, the machines weren't necessarily mass produced, so they couldn't be used to their fullest potential as they were before Janvier came along. Henry himself was trained at the Janvier facilities in Paris and learned every single aspect about this machine, purchased one and imported it back to the United States, or imported it to the United States, and was in fact the first Janvier pantograph in the United States at the time. This is circa 1902, 1903. And this completely revolutionized how coins and metals were made moving forward. Here we have the metal that's on the actual Janvier pantograph at the time. That's how I kind of know that this picture of the pantograph is from 1911, because it has the James Cardinal Gibbons Memorial Medal on it. Unfortunately, Weil purchased the pantograph for the Ditch Brothers in 1902, but due to the quickly ever-changing fashion statements of handbags at the time, by 1903, ladies' handbags and other materials were changing so much that they didn't require as much metallic trim on it. That just wasn't fashionable anymore. So the Ditch Brothers actually considered the Janvier pantograph useless within a rather quick amount of time. Little did they know that it would actually be the machine that made them. So in 1905, famed sculptor Augustin St. Gaudens had heard that the Ditch Brothers had acquired a Janvier pantograph, and was extremely intrigued by this because prior to this, before he would have to have his designs shipped to Europe and have them reduced over there. So having one domestically in the United States was huge at the time. This medal is one of several firsts for MACO that I'll show along the way during this presentation. It's the 1906 Benjamin Franklin Bicentennial Medal by Augustin St. Gaudens. This is the first design. There's actually a second design. St. Gaudens had designed this and didn't like how Franklin had turned out. His own criticism about it was that Franklin looked like a quote-unquote an old lady wearing a tiara. So he actually gave up on this design and essentially decommissioned himself and gave the job to his brother, Louis St. Gaudens, who eventually finished the production of it in the following year. In 1907, we have the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow Centennial Medal. This is by Bella Lyon Pratt. After his experience with St. Gaudens, Henry Weil began to advertise that he was able to reduce sculptural metals into dyes. And this medal here is actually the first commission that Henry had received after officially advertising his newly found talents. Many histories of MACO consider this the first medal produced by MACO and kind of ignore the earlier St. Gaudens piece for whatever reason. This piece in particular was struck by Tiffany and Company, and the same year, 1907, other orders began to roll in for Henry Weil, including works from Adolph Lyman and Victor David Brenner. That same year, 1907, the Philadelphia Mint kind of gets into the game of the Janvier pantograph and actually purchases one at the recommendation of Augustin St. Gaudens. This is kind of a famous story about how how the Mint kind of modernized in the early 20th century. This was not, however, the first foray into pantographs. I had mentioned earlier that Janvier didn't invent the pantograph, but in fact perfected it, and the United States Mint actually did own two previous versions of the pantograph. They had a contamin pantograph, which they used from 1836 to 1867, and a Hill pantograph, which they used from 1867 until they purchased the Janvier in 1907. After the Mint purchased it, the Janvier pantograph, it was actually Henry Weil himself who traveled down to Philadelphia from New York to train Mint officials on how to use the machine, since he was the most qualified person in the country at the time. One famous story about this excursion to Philadelphia occurred when Henry went on a lunch break during the training sessions. When he returned from his lunch break, he realized that someone had sabotaged the machine and readjusted all the settings so that it wouldn't work properly. He later found out that it was actually none other than Chief Engraver Charles Barber who had done this at the time. And Barber himself saw the Janvier pantograph as a direct threat to his own skills and livelihood, because this machine essentially took the engraver out of the equation and replaced engravers with sculptors, and then the actual engraving was done by this machine. So, seeing this machine as a threat, Barber just wasn't having it. Unfortunately, Barber lost in this fight, and the Mint began to use the Janvier in full force. The photograph of the Janvier here is actually much later than this period, and you can tell because the reverse of the Kennedy $half is on the machine. So this is circa 1964, late 1963, 1964. Moving on, 1909 was a very, very important year for MACO. It was a very active year. Business picked up and included several medals, but especially the reduction of 4 different medals that had to do with Lincoln's birth centennial, which of course happened in 1909. This one here was designed by Jules Edouard Brunet. He was commissioned by the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR, to design it for them. This piece is significant for MACO in particular because it is the first medal that actually has the MACO name on it. And you can see on the obverse at around the 5 o'clock area of the coin, just below the date 1865, it says MACO in kind of a stylized manner. This was engraved directly into the die, whereas most future references to MACO as the producer occurred via edge stamp on the edge of the coin around the 6 o'clock area. So that's, the significant medal as it actually says that MACO produced this medal. Ronay himself, who designed this piece, was a partner of, a business partner of Felix Weil, who was Henry Weil's brother, but I'll get back to that relationship in a minute. Additionally, in 1909, along with these 4 MACO Lincoln medals, MACO actually produced the hubs for the 1909 Lincoln cent. At the time, Victor David Brenner, the designer, actually only worked about 1 block away from where MACO was currently, or was positioned at the time. So it was actually much, much easier for him to just walk, essentially, his designs over to MACO rather than send them to Philadelphia. Not only that, but at the time, if he did send them to Philadelphia, then he would have had to deal with Charles Barber. As we saw, that Barber probably wouldn't be as receptive as MACO would have been at the time. That said, I truly believe that most sculptors and artists at the time considered MACO to be much more of an important mint for their needs than the Philadelphia Mint ever were. And most of these sculptors and engravers that we know that designed United States coins, they actually designed and had struck many, many more designs through MACO than they ever did through the Philadelphia Mint. So as I consider MACO the sculptor's mint, and they probably saw it as such as well. So this is Robert Hewitt Jr. He met the Weil brothers throughout 1909 because he's a major collector of Lincoln medals in particular. So all these new Lincoln medals, not only did Hewitt want to acquire, but he also actually had a hand in the production of several of them. So through this process of 1909 Lincoln, Hewitt met the Weil brothers. A little bit about him, I said he was a noted Lincoln collector. In fact, I believe his entire collection is still intact at the Smithsonian Institute. So it's still on view and you can go see it and visit it and everything else. He was the secretary of the ANS in the late 1860s, and then the second vice president of the ANS in the early 1880s, but his prime job was as a real estate investor throughout New York City. And it was actually Robert Hewitt Jr. who suggested the name Medallic Art Company. So, okay. So that said, who actually owned MACO, right? This is an advertisement circa 1910, 1909, 1910, from the Ditch brothers, not from the Weil brothers, not from MACO, but for the Ditch brothers, who, as we saw, were, sold sterling mounted leather goods, and this kind of medallic art business was really kind of a side project for Henry Weil. But the Ditch brothers saw this as their own. I mean, they're the ones who purchased the Janvier machine. Everything was kind of happening under their clock, so they assumed ownership of all of this. As you can see all the way down at the bottom, they consider themselves the sole agents for the Janvier reducing machine. Somebody accidentally spelled it Janiver on the advertisement, but we know what they're talking about. So it's really kind of an interesting kind of transitional advertisement where a lot of things are up in the air. So back to Robert Hewitt Jr. As you can see, noted Lincoln collector, ANSVP, suggested the medallic art name. Then I added a third kind of bullet point here. Once he found out that the Weil brothers were having such complications with the Ditch brothers, Hewitt went to Henry Weil and actually suggested that he purchase MACO and actually helped him negotiate the deal and even offered to act as kind of a ghost partner to help with any finances that needed. The Ditch brothers refused to sell and only offered Henry 49% of the company. Henry refused this offer, and the Ditch brothers went behind his back and sold all of the dies that Henry had reduced. They sold them to a rival company known as J.K. Davison, who operated in Philadelphia at the time. Fortunately for Henry, Davison and Company already owned a Janvier pantograph by this time and didn't need a second machine. So the Ditch brothers reluctantly sold their Janvier pantograph to Henry at this time. Otherwise, the Medallic Art Company wouldn't have existed, been able to move forward if Davison didn't own their own Janvier pantograph at the time. The story's not done, however. According to the Ditch brothers, through this purchase of the pantograph, Henry only purchased the pantograph, and the Ditch brothers, according to them, still owned the MACO name. And if Henry wanted to use the name Medallic Art Company, he would have to give them another $1,000, which he ultimately did. This is about $27,000 in 2021 dollars, which isn't a little bit of money, but at the same time is kind of chump change for the amount of deals that happen in today's climate, where people are spending millions, if not billions, of dollars just for the sole ownership of a name. So while I'm sure it was a shock to Henry that he had to hand over another $1,000, perhaps he got the better end of the deal in the end. So back to this advertisement by the Ditch brothers. One of the things that sticks out to me is kind of near the bottom. They say that they produce reductions and enlargements from sculptors' models direct from the plaster, dies cut, and here's the important part, metals struck. Now, up to this point, the Medallic Art Company never struck a metal. And I'm going to reiterate that from the beginning until about 1920, MACO did not strike any metals. They did not have the room, the machinery, the knowledge, or any of those abilities to do so. And they primarily served as solely a die reduction company, who then contracted the actual striking of the metals out to other companies. Some known mints that struck MACO metals during this time primarily included J.K. Davison of Philadelphia, whom I've already mentioned, Tiffany and Company in New York, and another firm named Lytle, who I haven't been able to specifically identify, but Felix Weil actually mentions them by name in his memoirs, so it's kind of hard to refute that. Later, after the metals were struck by one of these subcontracted companies, MACO would get the metals back, apply their edge stamp, and then the metals would go to another company, Rouenet and Weil, whom I briefly talked about earlier. This is Jules Rouenet and Felix Weil, their company, and they would actually apply the finish or the patina to the metals through a series of lacquers. Sometimes they would set the metals on fire with a blowtorch, and just any kind of way to artificially tone the metals so that they didn't look like this bright bronze material, but to actually have kind of an aged patina to it. Felix himself called this process coloring the coin, the metals. So while we would call it, finishing or applying the patina, they called it just coloring the metals. Okay, so I've mentioned Felix Weil a few times, so now I'm going to properly introduce him. He's the younger brother of Henry Weil. Unlike Henry, who was born in New Jersey, Felix was actually born in the time period when his family went back to France. So unlike several, the often told, familial history during this period where, some children were born in Europe and then they would come here and the rest of the family was born in the United States. It was actually the exact opposite for them, where the older children were born in the United States and then the youngers were born back in France. like his older brother, Henry, Felix was trained as a sculptor from a young age. In 1908, I mentioned René Violin Company was formed with the sculptor Jules Edouard René. In 1910, along with Henry, he was kind of a part of this legal battle to retain the MACO name, and his name is in fact listed as one of the incorporators of the Medallic Art Company as the New York State Corporation. And it wasn't until 1915 that he became a full partner. In this period between 1910 and 1915, Viel was mostly still in partnership with René and didn't really work terribly directly with MACO, except for applying the finishes and stuff like that through this other company. However, unbeknownst to René, brothers Henry and Felix Weil actually had a secret pact with each other. Whatever money the two of them earned in a given year, they would essentially split it, right? So that if one, just for an example, if one brother earned $10,000 a year and the other earned $0, then they would both claim $5,000. Not a bad deal for the lazier of the two. I'm not saying that one was lazy, but I'm saying. More than likely, this pact actually helped save and really keep MACO afloat during this period. René and Weil and company were much more successful during this period, and MACO really wasn't. And without this kind of secret pact, there's the possibility that MACO wouldn't have been able to survive. In 1915, René became ill and went back to France, where he passed away the following year, and that was kind of the end of René and Weil, and that was the impetus for Felix to join his brother at MACO. Okay, so this is the 1910 Algernon Sidney Sullivan plaquette, designed and sculpted by René, whom I've mentioned, but more importantly for MACO, this is actually the first medal that was produced by MACO with the Weil brothers as the sole owners. So this is their first foray without Ditch brothers, without anything. This is their medal and no one else's. So kind of an important piece. I actually hope that you guys can see this, but I have a Galvano here of the reverse of this piece. It's not the original Galvano. As you can see, there's more script down here than there is on the original piece. This is from a restrike that MACO produced in 1962. So some of these more classic designs, they continue to use and repurpose for other events. But you can also see how big the original designs were, whereas this finished metal that I have displayed on the screen is actually probably cell phone sized or something along those lines. So and then it's actually this a Galvano like that would be attached to the Janvier pantograph, where that machine alone would reduce it and engrave the die. Moving forward, I'd like to talk about the Circle of Friends of the Medallion series. This is an extremely important series of medals that was started by Charles Decay, Robert Hewitt Jr., who we've met, Jules Edouard René, whom we've met, and the Weil brothers. They issued only 12 medals between 1909 and 1915. It was kind of like a subscription-based program where they hoped to get as many as 500 subscribers, but at their height, they had about 400 members at any given time. Later, this inspired a much more prolific series of medals known as the Society of Medalists, which existed from 1930 to 1955 or 1995, excuse me. And this is kind of seen as the forerunner of that series. I show this medal here to the left in particular. This is the Joan of Arc medal. Is number 12 of 12 that they made, so the last one. And it's actually this metal that people believe caused the end of the Circle of Friends medallion. First, I would like to show you this. This is a book. And as you can see, the metal itself is actually in the book. And this is how the Circle of the Friends of the Medallion series were distributed. There were several pages that talked about the sculptor and the piece in particular, gave any important historical backgrounds, and then the whole middle section actually has a cutout, and the metal itself is produced, was set in there and that's how it's sold. Robert Hewitt Jr. was the person who wrote the inscriptions in there, the first few pages, and the first few pages, the opening chapter for the Joan of Arc medal in particular, was very propagandistic in that this was just as World War I was starting, and the way that he wrote the description kind of turned England, who burned Joan of Arc at the stake, turned them into the Germans of World War I, which Americans weren't necessarily thrilled with at the time. And there was kind of a big uproar amongst the 400 subscribers of the series, and it's thought that this uproar actually caused the end of the series. And that, sadly, it ended because of his, produced incredible works of art by, the world's most renowned sculptors at the time, but was, unfortunately, ended too early. So I would like to now introduce Clyde C. Trees. This large metal to the left is of Trees. It was actually designed by John Ray Sinnock, who later became the chief engraver of the United States Mint. And this metal is from a little bit later. As you can see, it's from 1940. But that's Trees, a beautiful rendition of him by Sinnock. He is a native of Indiana. He is actually a distant relative of an acquaintance of the Weil brothers. He completely changed the direction that MACO is heading, from solely a fine metallic arts company to the largest private mint in the United States. And he was able to purchase a surplus World War I press from somebody in Massachusetts, circa 1920. And it's at this point that MACO is finally able to begin striking their own metals. Again, before this, they didn't strike a single piece for several reasons. Interestingly, when Trees and the Weil brothers were introduced, instead of the Weil brothers interviewing Trees to see if he was capable enough to manage their company, the interview process actually was reversed. It was Trees who had interviewed the Weil brothers, both about their reputation and the quality of their work, and demanded references too. And it was actually sculptor James Earl Fraser and the American Numismatic Society who ultimately gave positive references of the Weil brothers to Clyde Trees. Further apart, the Weil brothers actually did realize that striking their own metals was necessary just prior to this. In around 1918, they began to kind of put out feelers to see if anyone was interested in a partnership with them. They had contacted a company called Green Duck Company that was in Chicago, but this would have required the brothers to move to Chicago, which they weren't willing to do. And they also had talks with the rival company J.K. Davison in Philadelphia, but that also didn't fully materialize at all for that matter. So in 1920, Clyde C. Trees officially joined MACO as a manager of sorts, the day-to-day manager. MACO reincorporated with the state of New York. Henry was listed as president, Felix was vice president, and Trees was the secretary treasurer. The Weil brothers owned 51% of the company, and Trees owned 49% of the company. And in addition to purchasing that first press for MACO, Trees also was responsible for securing a much larger location for them at 137 East 29th Street, New York City, where they stayed for quite a while, and also hired their first full-time employee, a man named John Hartle. So this is really the time period when MACO kind of becomes essentially interests that two brothers have into a fully fledged company. So here's the three of them: Felix Weil, Clyde Trees, and Henry Weil. This is sometime in the 1930s, so a little bit later than what we're the period we're talking about, but nonetheless a good image of the three of them. Throughout the 1920s, the relationship was tenuous at best. The brothers and Trees each had different directions that they wanted to take the company. The Weil brothers wanted to keep it kind of as this low-key sculptural arts, medallic arts company that they simply just produced dies and metals for their sculptor friends, whereas Trees wanted to maximize production and promote the company to no end, which he ultimately did. Throughout the decade, each side tried to buy out the other side, but neither was ever successful in raising the funds to do so until 1929, when Clyde Trees did successfully buy out the Weil brothers from Medallic Art Company. However, Trees wanted to retain the Weil brothers as consultants, and also requested that at least one of them was at the production facility at all times. So the Weil brothers agreed to this, and they worked out a deal amongst themselves where one of the brothers would be at MACO 6 months of the year and take a vacation for the other 6 months, and then they would swap brothers. By this time, MACO was a fully functional operation and already had hundreds of clients, and quickly became the largest and most important private mint in the United States, and really retained this prestige until the early 2000s. I wanted to show this. This is also from a little bit later. This is from the April 9th, 1937 Sculptors Dinner. They had a one-off dinner where they invited all their sculptor friends to this big giant dinner to celebrate the life of sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens. There's several important people in here. John Flanagan, DeFranchici is in here, Janet Scudder, several artists that numismatists are very aware of, as well as many others that aren't, but had significant roles and significant pieces produced by MACO during this period. As a little interesting anecdote from this evening, sadly, about a block away from the MACO premises, a young woman was murdered, unfortunately. An eyewitness to the murder said that the suspect was dressed, quote unquote, like a sculptor, whatever that means. So the police, actually knowing that the Medallic Art Company was only a block away, they went there, and this is what they found. While searching for a sculptor-like suspect, they find 100-odd sculptors. I don't know if any of them at the time are dressed like sculptors, but they are nonetheless sculptors. And the police did interrogate every single person that was at the dinner that night. So kind of a little interesting anecdote. Felix himself in his memoirs said that surely it was an evening that no one would ever forget. And that's it. Thank you. This here, just to give some context to the medal itself, this is a medal of Henry Weil that was produced by Jenna Jusko and of course struck by MACO. So that's it. If there's any questions or anything like that, I'm sure that that's what we will be getting to next.
All right, thanks a lot, Jesse. We do have a few questions here, and if anyone would like to ask a question, just move your cursor down to the bottom of the screen and hover over more and click that. And then you'll see a link to the Q&A box, and you can just enter your question there. All right, first question, do all pieces have MACO in the design or on the edge of the metal?
No. The one piece that I showed did have like a stylized MACO name in the die on the design itself. That's the only one that I can think of off the top of my head that has that like that. I did see others, but from much later, from the 50s and 60s, that actually have the MACO logo, the French head logo in the die itself as well. And as far as the edge goes, not all of the early ones had their name on the edge either, for several reasons. Of course, they didn't strike them all. Some of the dies that they reduced were, struck by other companies that had their own distribution hub already, so they didn't necessarily need MACO to edge stamp and distribute it for them, most notably J.K. Davison and Company. So no, not all of them had MACO in the design or on the edge, but the majority of them did.
All right, next question. I have a 3-inch metal designed by Victor D. Brenner in 1916 for Hecla and Calumet mining that seems to be MACO's work, but I cannot find any markings. So is there any way of attributing this?
Yeah, that's, before MACO had their own mint, so they weren't necessarily striking everything nor edge stamping everything at the time. I can do a little bit more research for you to see if what I can find on that metal. I know that Brenner in particular, a lot of his works were reduced by MACO on their pantograph, but not necessarily struck by MACO, even into the late teens and early 20s. Some of his stuff, was even struck, by the U.S. Mint themselves, not necessarily just the Lincoln Cent. I'm thinking primarily of the 1910 tuberculosis medal, which MACO reduced the dies for, but then the United States Mint struck several thousand of.
All right, so for that, I would suggest to the questioner to follow up with Jesse at ANS. And Jesse, your email is what?
Kraft, JKRAFT @numismatics.org.
Okay, and I think that address is also on the ANS website.
Correct.
All right, next question. Do you agree with the late Dick Johnson that refinishing a metal does it no harm?
Yes and no. I mean, it is no longer an original metal at the time, once you refinish it. But metals aren't coins, which is an important distinction. And a metal collector might not see any harm in this, whereas a coin collector would absolutely see harm in this. And the same goes for like restriking metals, which, in the medallic art world, that's common practice and fully accepted. Whereas, if a coin were restruck, coin collectors need to know the distinction, and that distinction is crucial in so many things, whether it's history, value, so on and so forth, where that's not necessarily the case with metals. So yes, I agree that it does harm to the metal, but is that harm, will that harm affect the metal on the market as much as it would a coin? I don't necessarily think it would.
Yeah, I think it's analogous to rebinding a book. It's no longer original, but depending on the new binding, it may be more desirable to collectors.
Exactly.
All right, next one. Curious to know how extensive the archival data you have for the modern issues, especially the last 20 years.
That actually comprises the majority of the archival paper archives that we were able to save. It's when you get to these earlier years that things start to become more sparse. In 1972, 1973, MACO moved from New York City up to Danbury, Connecticut, and from what I understand, a lot of paper archives were simply thrown out at that time, and even stuff like galvanos, plasters were literally just thrown out, unfortunately. So the bulk of our material is from this early 70s up to the present, for basically everything. I mean, that's not to say everything comes from this more modern time period, but the bulk of it absolutely is.
All right, next question. Does ANS have plans to use the dyes they acquired to restrike some of the metals, possibly the more rarer pieces?
No, the only ones, well, this is a tricky question. The dyes themselves, actually, two companies purchased the dyes. First, the ANS, we purchased the more historical dyes, and then any active dyes that are still being struck, that are still commissioned, things that are awarded annually and stuff like that. The Metal Kraft mint in Wisconsin actually purchased those. So anything that is still active, you kind of have to go through Metal Kraft and not the ANS. And for our dyes in particular, we don't necessarily plan on restriking them.
All right, next question. What was the other contractor besides Davidson that you mentioned striking MACO metals in the earlier days?
Lidl, so L-E-I-D-E-L. I found some references to a quote-unquote local Swiss company in New York that had struck metals for MACO, and I think that Lidl and this local Swiss company are one and the same. But yeah, L-E-I-D-E-L.
Okay. Next question. Did MACO ever cast metals?
Yeah, absolutely. 99.9 whatever percent were struck, but there are absolutely some casts, and even a couple forged pieces that I came across where literally, a sheet of metal was put over a die and somebody smacked it with a hammer a bunch of times until the design was on the other side. So some forged, some cast, but the vast majority are struck.
All right. Next question. I believe you said the early dyes of MACO were sold to J.K. Davidson. Do those dyes still exist?
I can't answer that with certainty, unfortunately, at this point. The dyes, we haven't fully even begun to catalog in that regard. We are able to bring back the metals and paper archives to New York, and we focused on that. We're actually in the earliest stages of bringing back the galvanos from Nevada to New York. So that's kind of our next big thing. To put this into perspective, it's about 17,000 galvanos, about 1,000 boxes, 90 pallets, or 4 tractor trailer loads of material. So that's what I'll be dealing with for a little while. And then we'll be able to focus on the dyes after that.
All right. And then can you speak to the publications or catalogs that ANS intends to produce related to this collection?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Can you speak to the catalogs or inventories that ANS will publish on this collection? And
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that we were able to retain is essentially both digital and printed out catalog of one of each of their metals. There are missing pieces, it's riddled with errors and so on and so forth. It actually is, you can find the digital version of it online at numismatics.org/MACO. And there is a digital version of that there. As I'm going through the collection, I'm noting these errors, fixing them, and then eventually we will publish a corrected version with high resolution digital images and so on and so forth. But we wanted to get this kind of error digital copy at least available to collectors, because it's such an important resource. Not only that, but I will say that lots of collectors have been extremely helpful in helping find errors within this massive catalog. So it's actually been beneficial to us as well that we did post this in its natural state because people have been able to help out. We've been able to give it to collectors to use. So there's been a lot of interaction between myself and various collectors on with this catalog alone. So that's one aspect that that we will produce moving forward. And I actually also have two books, historical books in mind. One is just a history of MACO. What I presented, in my mind, I see as kind of like chapters 2 and 3, maybe something like that, and then a second book as well.
All right, next question. MACO made some of the Jewish American Hall of Fame medals beginning in 1969. Will the ANS pledge not to sell those dies or redistribute them?
Again, the dies are currently in 2 different hands right now. What dies are in what collection, I can't necessarily speak to off the top of my head. So that is something that I can't necessarily pledge to at this moment. And there is a possibility that a lot of the MACO dies will retain with the Medallic Art Company, which Kraft currently owns. So so that's the state of the dies right now.
All right. Next question. How did MACO come to be acquired by Northwest Territorial Mint?
That is for my next presentation. No, I'm kidding. MACO went bankrupt a few times throughout its later career. Unfortunately, the U.S. bicentennial may have had something to do with that, where a lot of medals were produced for the bicentennial in the early 1970s. I think MACO was the recipient of a lot of these commissions. And I believe that they kind of got too big too fast. And it's during this period that they relocated to Connecticut to a much bigger location. But unfortunately, after 1976, people stopped commissioning metals in such high quantities, and their orders just declined very rapidly after the bicentennial. And that was one of a few bankruptcies that happened. And in one of the bankruptcies, I think it happened in 2009, is when the Northwest Territorial Mint ultimately purchased it. And then, Northwest Territorial themselves went bankrupt in 2018. And that's when the ANS stepped in to kind of recover the archives and this history.
And how much time of your bandwidth, or what percentage of your bandwidth has been allocated to MACO related activities?
For me personally, in my role?
Yeah.
It's been kind of like an on again, off again sort of project for me. Right now, since we're dealing with all the galvanos in Nevada, it is 100% on. But like during the pandemic, when I didn't have necessarily as much access to the metals and stuff, I had to focus on other things. So it's been definitely more than 50-50, but at times, it's different just based on what's happening.
And is the intention to eventually house all this material at ANS, or are you going to retain offsite storage?
We do hope to retain what we hope to retain at the ANS, if that makes sense. We don't necessarily have plans on retaining everything from the archives, but what we do wish to retain will be housed at the ANS.
Another question. I was able to recover the dies for the medal that I commissioned for the ANA judges. Those dies are in my office a few feet away. So I expect you'll have continued concerns about, people who used MACO for something and, not necessarily wanting those dies to be out in public hands.
Those are weekly emails I get. So yes, I don't expect those to die down.
Yeah, and I don't think the ANS has any immediate plans to deaccession any of this material, correct?
Some we may. I mean, in reality, at this point, 0 objects have been formally accessioned into the ANS collection because it's literally the largest purchase or donation the ANS has ever made. hundreds of thousands of objects and literally hundreds of tons of material. So we're not even at the point to have begun to accession things formally into the collection.
Yeah, so this is just a lot of material to get your arms around, and I know everyone's trying to be as forthcoming as possible, but you can't always answer these really specific questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I think that's it for the questions.
Excellent.
So Jesse, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure.
And for everyone else, see the NNP Symposium homepage for additional events over the weekend. All right, thank you, Jesse.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye.